Thank you, Aleš. And thank you for letting me do this talk today. I'll just say a little bit about where it arises from. It arose from some sort of dissatisfaction, I think, with the rapidly expanding literature on predictive policing, which has happened in a very short space of time, I must say, but also with the sense that a lot of it was very ahistorical and really would only go far back as Comstat and the new NYPD, but not much further than that. So this is an attempt, I guess, to give a sort of history of the present, if you like, of predictive policing and look back at some of its origins. And I'm going to look at a couple of issues, one being what I would call the mathematisation of policing in the 1960s, but I want to go further back. I'd take that story further back, but I'll touch on what I want to do. To excuse myself from any sort of having to deal with any empirical realities, I'm going to phrase this in terms of socio-technical imaginaries, a term that I take from the STS scholar Sheila Jasanoff, and her definition of that, and she is borrowing from the political philosopher Charles Taylor and his idea of modern social imaginaries there. Jasanoff defines it as this collectively held and performed visions of desirable futures animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. Importantly, these socio-technical imaginaries need to be collective, durable and capable of being formed, and they are co-productive, if you like. So that's what I want to sort of focus on. I just wanted to give a bit of context, because one thing that does interest me is the amount of public interest, not only academic interest, in predictive policing. It's been an enormous sort of phenomena, and there's a question about whether it's anything new. I think it is, to some extent, but it comes at a time where I think, once again, as societies in the West did, at least in the 1960s, we are having a lot of discussions about automation, driverless cars, robot Amazon factories, all those kinds of things. And I think predictive policing lands within that sort of cultural milieu, and that's one of the reasons why everyone is so fascinated with it at present, aside from its sort of social science fiction element of claiming to know the future. So that was just one point I wanted to make. I'll give a very broad, I'm talking about predictive policing in a very broad sense here, and not simply, I am only talking about systems used by police, but I do acknowledge that the systems are different, they use different data sources, they use different algorithms, etc. But I'm really talking about some of the rationalities that underpin predictive policing systems rather than any sort of specific system itself. So I'll just make that caveat for myself there. Is it new? Yes, I think it is. In some important ways it is new, but it is also old as well. And that's the story that I want to tell today a little bit. And I want to look back at technological innovations in policing and how those have been viewed at the time and the impacts they actually had on police organisation. I should say something else I'm doing here, which is slightly different from what's normally done, is I'm particularly interested in predictive policing as a management tool of police resources and as a means of restraining and surveilling police. That's one of my sort of key interests here. Historically, that has always been the case. Any control system in police organisations, all their surveillance is reflexive surveillance. Anything that looks out looks back in. And I hope that'll be clear as we sort of go along. I also think that predictive policing raises another issue, and that is the connection between policing and political economy, the connection of policing to our economic structures, and also something that's interesting me in this project, which I'm at an early stage of, admittedly, is the way that ideas from management and business find their way into policing. And there's a kind of circle. Often those ideas have also gone into military spheres as well. So there's a sort of circularity between business, military and policing sort of forms of organisation, if you like. And those forms of organisation do reflect very much the economic structures of the societies they are a part. And with this sort of example of advertisements, I think we see a way in which the digital economy, if you like, or surveillance capitalism, as it's sometimes called, is making such a big impact, and that's another reason, I think, why predictive policing is the sort of talking point that it is presently. The other thing that interests me is the idea of speed, which Mark addressed in his talk, but I think it's very important here. And I'm going to go back to some older sort of sociology here in relation to time-space compression, and particularly the work of David Harvey in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, talked about this. But it obviously draws its inspiration from Marx's quote from the Grundrisse here: the more developed the capital, the more extensive the market over which it circulates, the more does it strive simultaneously for an ever greater extension of the market and for greater annihilation of space by time. Both Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, and David Harvey were writing about this in the 1980s and 1990s. Time-space compression was used a lot in geography particularly. But there is a more recent accelerationist literature that looks at this idea, and if you feel that the world is getting faster all the time, then the reason is it is getting faster all the time. That's why. And I want to look at how that's impacted upon policing, because it certainly has, because I think one thing we see with predictive policing is almost an end point to this, the total acceleration of policing, if you like, but it's been there for a while. So just to step back a bit, I want to talk about earlier police organisation, and here I want to talk about what I call policing the clockwork city, the mechanical model of the beat system, certainly taken from the London Metropolitan Police in 1829, the idea of organised fixed beats, as in this little, that's a beat map there from Melbourne, Australia. You can see all was sort of ordered there, all the time specified there on how long it would take you. By 1888, they'd actually worked out that a police officer should walk at 2 miles an hour. That was apparently the correct pace, 2 miles an hour, and you could observe everything on your beat. The beat was an example, again, sort of to refer to Mark's paper, it was an example of disciplinary power. The organisation of police beats was essentially a giant panopticon in motion. It was a vision machine in motion. That was the sort of idea. But it was a vision machine that not only watched people, it watched police as well. And this got tighter and tighter and tighter into the early 20th century. By 1906, in one Royal Commission report, they were talking about beat constables or police walking the street as nothing more than walking dolls, that they had actually become automatons almost completely. And actually, that the beat itself had become the objective, that the idea was just to keep walking the beat regularly, and in fact, that constables were rushing from place to place to actually meet the sergeant who was supposed to meet them at an appointed time to make sure they were walking their beat. So it became a purely disciplinary apparatus in some ways, but it was also widely criticised as well for its sheer predictability. There was always accusations that the clever criminal would know exactly where the beats were, how fast they were moving, and would be able to work around them. That was one of the complaints that was made of the sort of beat system. They even suggested at one point that police officers should wear felt slippers so that their boots wouldn't make any noise and frighten people off. So there were attempts to do this, but by the early 20th century, and here I'm making huge generalisations about policing across continents, but I'm talking mainly in an Anglo-American sense here. By the early 20th century, the beat was seen as a failed thing, a sign of old times. It was like the police organisation of iron and steam in an electrical age, if you like. It was seen as outdated, outmoded. It remained, and is still there to some extent, but it was seen as behind the times. Where this really starts to change, the story moves a little bit to the United States, because, how am I going for time there? There's two key developments in the 1920s in policing, both in the United States and an example I know very well in Australia, but I know it's also in the UK, is radio, wireless radio. The equipping of patrol cars with wireless radio creates an entirely different dynamic for policing. Mostly, it focuses on this idea of time and speed. It's also answering certain practical problems about the development of cities, particularly cities in the New World, if you like, in the United States and Australia. Sprawling suburbs, too big to patrol by foot patrols. The answer was seen to lie in both cars, automobiles, and the wireless radio. But something else is happening. Policing was developing a huge bureaucracy, and it was also becoming more and more paper-driven. So there are more and more archives, if you like, as well. There's more and more ways to locate individuals. And one way that this manifests itself is with the advent of fingerprinting and the fingerprint archive, the idea that you could historically go back and find someone. But more emphasis was given to what was seen as the ultimate symbol of modernity, which was the police radio and two-way radio communication. That was seen to be the big thing. And there's a small quote there. That's actually from a little Australian handbook put out by a company called the Amalgamated Wireless Company, and they put that out, and you can read that for yourself. But there's another one here, and this is from August Vollmer, who was the sort of chief of police professionalism in the United States. And it's a wonderful little quote, so I will just take a little bit of time to read this. He says, "With the advent of the radio-equipped car, a new era has come. The sadly depleted ranks of the patrolman who walks the beat is now bolstered up. Districts of many square miles, which formerly were officially watched by only a few men, who in the very nature of the case could not watch the area, are now covered by the roving patrol car. Fast, efficient, stealthy, having a regular beat to patrol, just as liable to be within 60 feet as 3 miles of the crook plying his trade. The very enigma of the specialised fellow, who is coming to realise now that a few moments may bring them down about him like a swarm of bees, this lightning swift angel of death." That was his quote, and that was the idea of the police radio. Police radio was seen as efficient because it could compress time and space, and it was the idea of the invisible inspector, if you want to see it in Foucauldian terms. The idea that the police could pop up anywhere at any time was the idea that was put forward, both in the sort of press releases and in other areas. But there was a lot more that went along with that police professionalisation agenda. And this is August Vollmer here. That quote was from 1931. What Vollmer brought to policing, sometimes called professionalisation, was more accurately bureaucratisation, really, than professionalisation. But it relied on a couple of key ideas, and one was the bringing of the ideas of Frederick Taylor into policing, the idea of sort of time and motion, efficiency, modern management, etc., were brought into policing. Other changes too were the standardisation and quantification of police reports. Police reports in the late 19th century were large, free-form narratives, often quite rambling. What Vollmer and his subsequent successors did was make police reports statistical. They had clear boxes to be ticked, they could be analysed, and analysed as a set. So that was quite an important development. In the United States, it was also in the early 20th century, around about sort of in the 1920s, 1990, around there, is a Bureau of Municipal Statistics, which starts to do the first sort of calculated work on policing, starts to actually look at patrol, starts to look at what police tries to measure it. And there's a number of different systems that they use for that. So there's a scientific study of policing in that sense. So just to move on there. Moving in, policing continues in that way. Vollmer's system was very much designed to solve a police problem, and the police problem was a problem of command. The fact that officers were largely autonomous, and the problem that is sometimes described as, and forgive the gendered language, but it was true at the time, where are my men? That was the sort of standard, call of the police sergeant. Where are people? The idea of tracking and locating officers was very important and was one of the problems that radio telephony was supposed to kind of address, if you like. This continues into the 1940s, and the professionalisation, bureaucratisation model becomes dominant. And it is very much an application, if you like, of ideas like operations management, systems management, and cybernetics, if you like to go back to the work of Norbert Weiner and people like that. These were ideas that often came out of conflict. A lot of it arose out of World War II and the desire to have quick and efficient supply chains in war. But those sort of ideas were brought back into policing. There had been some experiments with closely sort of looking at police work. O.W. Wilson, who was actually a kind of protege of August Vollmer, developed something called hazard scoring. So he would give certain police activities a higher score, and that would dictate how many resources. So a robbery might be an 8, whereas a call from the public would be a 2. The amount of resources expended on a call related to that score. They also use time to some extent, looking at different offences and saying how long each one would take. Where we start to see a huge development is in the 1960s, and particularly in the United States with the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration, which also ends up, as a matter of fact, funding a lot of plans for police modernisation, but also funding enormous amounts of research into policing. And for the first time, you get a combination of 2 very interesting things. You get the first sociological studies of policing, which revealed some quite striking things, particularly that a lot of what the police did had nothing at all to do with crime, which came as a surprise to a lot of people at the time. 50% of their activities in one study were actually spent on administration. And this is an interesting aspect of that. But what comes out of it is a science and technology report, and even in that report they talk about the idea of using portable recording devices, that police work could be sped up by the entry into the field, if you like, into police operations of portable technology that could record on the spot. And they envisaged this. But you also see a whole lot of technocratic models, and some of these come out of work by the RAND Corporation, which was formed, which was originally part of the US Air Force for its initial part, and then moves on to these studies of police procedure. And they come up with police allocation models. One is the hypercube model, which was a way to prioritise calls. That's another police, I've forgotten the acronym now, but that's another model for allocating police to patrol. It was a mathematical model. And that's AVM, something that they were trying to do for quite some time, which is automated vehicle monitoring, which was something, of course, they wanted to do. So there were experiments with that in the 1960s. I'll just turn to ComStat briefly, because it's the one that is particularly associated, I think, with predictive policing and often seen as its precursor, and it is to some extent, so that's a fair enough call. But I just want to quickly mention something else. The management of policing remained extremely hierarchical, but in the period from the 1930s to the 1960s anyway, it had taken on the attributes of the modern business enterprise. If earlier models of policing were based on status and hierarchy, in the United Kingdom particularly, chief constables, as they're known in the UK, were often former high-ranking military men. They were men from the upper tiers of society, and they ruled over a workforce which was entirely working class. Vollmer and others came up with had a different model, which was the police professional from the ranks. That did not mean, however, a democratisation of policing, because the police officer from the ranks became an elitist himself. He became the manager, and there was very much an emphasis in this period on charismatic leaders, that they were the future of policing, that policing would be reformed through charismatic leadership. And Vollmer, his protege Wilson and others were examples of this sort of mentality, that a chief commissioner could change things. So it's a hierarchical organisation, and one of its main purposes is reducing officer autonomy, retaining strict control over individual officers in some way or another, be that disciplinary or whatever. ComStat is interesting for a slightly different reason, in that it envisages a different model. The model is very much a neoliberal model. It's an economic model. The model is that the commanders of precincts will be responsible for their particular area. They will want to get the statistics, the crime stats down as far as possible, and they compete with other precinct commanders. So it's based on an idea of competition, elevating everyone to the top. It's kind of something that happens in the 1970s very much, and as a result of, I think, to some extent, the failure of policing in the United States in the 1960s, and particularly large-scale urban riots, is calls for decentralisation of policing, calls for different models of organisation. So we have ComStat there, which tries something different. So it's actually giving more authority to individual commanders, and they're in competition. So there's an internal market, if you like, in that sense. Other things which seem different, or which seem perhaps not part of this overall picture, is the idea of community policing and problem-oriented policing. But actually these fit into the same picture, because with mobile communications, it no longer mattered so much where an officer was. They could still be contacted. There could be that sort of autonomy. But I just want to move forward to some of the differences here. Computer technology in the 1970s and 80s was mainly used in police organisations for those kind of purposes, for personnel management and for the distribution of patrol, the mathematical distribution of patrol. Those were the main, and obviously the computerisation of criminal records as well. So that was the main purposes of it. However, the computers were large, they often required external expertise to run, and police agencies generally didn't have the sort of capacity to do them. What is different with predictive policing is this idea of a complete sort of democratisation, if you like, of the technology. And in this, I would link predictive policing also with wider trends in the digitalisation of policing, including all the sort of Blackberries and other devices that police are now carrying around and having issued to them, that are kind of part of this picture. And this has been an advertising claim that's quite clear. So we see that this is from one Wynyard Group, a New Zealand company actually says this about this sort of black boxing. The technical capacity is hidden from the user and the science is already built in. That's supposed to be a very attractive ploy because it can be used by your average police officer without any technical knowledge. That's the idea. And Predpol is the one that's suggesting intuitive usability with one click of a mouse, and it's this idea that it's simple, easy to use, because this was the traditional problem, if you like. The point that sometimes gets missed here with Predpol is that prediction of crime, if you like, or analysis is only part of it. But this is from Predpol, and here you can see what proportion of this pie, if you like, they are dedicating to patrol operations. A good part of Predpol's supposed functionality is actually to monitor police. That's what a lot of it is about. And in fact, Jeff Moller, who's one of the mathematician associated with Predpol, specifically said that the tracking enabled by Predpol allows you to basically see what police are doing at any time and tell them to go somewhere else. So if you see an officer just sitting there in the red square that Predpol's designated as the area and he's not doing anything, then someone can ring up from the control room and just tell him to keep, move along. So that it's used for those kinds of ideas, and they are more and more, these systems are advertising themselves as being able to efficiently record police activity and analyse that. Andrew Ferguson, in his book that I notice is being advertised here, The Rise of Big Data Policing, has a chapter on this, on blue data, algorithms that are used in recruitment, that are used in trying to weed out corruption, those kind of things. All these sort of different algorithms for policing are there. But back to the time theme, which I've dropped a little bit for the moment. The other claim for Predpol is this idea of policing in real time. This is constantly sort of emphasised, that it's going to be updated all the time. It's going to be policing in real time. This is a quote that was quite frightening in some ways, and it was from a company called Axon, which used to be Taser, I think. But this is what they said. This was supposedly an interview with a police officer about what he thought it could do, what their system could do. I could potentially walk down the street with the camera in real time, scanning faces, sending that data back to the cloud. That type of real-time application would be huge. So he's imagining some future scenario in which data is constantly flowing backwards and forwards. And this is the imaginary of predictive policing. The officer is an informational node of constant inputs and outputs, constantly sending out signals and constantly receiving new information. The important point about this real time, though, is that it's an augmented real time. It's a real time that is based on historical data, mixed with present data, mixed with future projection. So it is not a real-time. What it is actually the bringing of online real-time into the real world, in a sense, into the material world. That's the vision of it, in a sense. And I love this quote, which is quite older now, from Adrian Mackenzie, where he talks about this. Real-time attempts to collapse the intervals between event and its reception so that the event is structured by its processing. There are military rationalities in this sort of form of prediction, which are important, and I'll just touch on those quickly. The officer in real time and linked up to the predictive policing system is supposed to have situational awareness. That's what it's supposed to produce, situational awareness of the police officer. This itself is a military term that goes back to World War I aerial combat. But interestingly, this idea of real-time information, the constantly transmitted, if you like, officer, is part or reflects what was called the Revolution in Military Affairs in the United States military, but that itself was an adoption of the ideas of business, moving on from the large corporations of the 60s, 70s and 80s to what was seen as the modern organisation, the flexible organisation that was quick on its feet and could move round. Policing has always been accused of being behind the times. Predictive policing opens up, I suppose, the chance that it's going to be a flexible organisation that can constantly adjust itself to the changing pressures of society. So that is the kind of idea that's there. Now, Brian Masumi, in an excellent book called Onto Power, actually talks about this a bit, and how this uncertainty, this continual flux, is really an image of the economy itself. That is what it is, flexible, constant change, constant innovation. It's the idea that these organisations are reflecting that economy to a great extent. And this is what Brian Masumi, talking about recent US military theory, has this quote, which I think gives us some sense of what the real-time cop of my title is actually about and how the time sequences are viewed. His quote here is that, considering that time is now of the essence of war, the evolutionary feedback is in as close to real time as possible, the up and down feedback occurring with such lightning speed as to make the military hierarchy the topological equivalent of the network. And I see this very much in predictive policing. That's the sort of idea that policing becomes networked rather than the strict bureaucratic, technocratic organisations of the 60s and 70s, that is what it's looking at. And actually, you can see similar ideas here. This is the soldier with 100 eyes. This is the idea of the totally datified battlefield. The soldier here being hooked into all this and receiving information about things happening on the ground in real time. All this is, much is made of this real time, quite obviously. The other thing about predictive policing, which opens up a lot of different angles, is actually the capacity for tracking once you start to get into smart cities and once you start to bring in different media into the data hunger, if you like, of predictive policing. Up there is Stingray, which I think, I'm not sure, someone might be able to tell me, you might know about this, but so I think Stingray is illegal now. No? It's not, sort of? Only in America can you have something that's a little bit illegal.
If I may, in European countries, IMSI catcher, we call it IMSI catcher, you call it Stingray, it's being legalized so police can use it legally.
Yeah, so basically what they're doing is they're pulling all the mobile phones, essentially, and all the lists of people on your mobile phones as well. So that's what it's doing. So it can do network analysis on that kind of thing. So that's the idea. But the opportunities for tracking in the smart city are sort of infinite, as is the closer monitoring than ever before of what the police are actually doing. If we're thinking about this vision, it's part of a whole picture of the increasing transparency of policing in some ways, or its increasing visibility, body cams, handheld phones, all the rest of it constantly recording what police are doing. And this is certainly part of it. This one intrigues me because one of the problems that happened with the professionalisation model of people like Vollmer was that while the motor car made police more mobile and the telephone made them more accessible, the telephone also made police far more accessible to the public. And with the founding of emergency numbers, police found that they were being absolutely swamped with calls. So the problem from the 40s to the 60s is continually this question of responding to calls, that they are getting so many calls they can't respond to them. My curiosity here is that they may be doing the same thing with predictive policing systems, or at least digital policing systems. This is Reporty, which is being used in Nice, I believe, Nice, France, at the moment. The idea of this is that you just take videos of things and send them to police on this sort of platform, and they get all this sort of information. The opportunities, while we hear a lot, and I think it's a warranted discussion, while we hear a lot about the potential of predictive policing to escalate or amplify discrimination, there is also a possibility that these kind of digital systems with predictive policing being part of that may actually lead to paralysis rather than action in many cases. By the Vietnam War, which was fought very much on the basis of sort of systems management and statistical data, reached points of absolute paralysis primarily because of that. So that is what I'm sort of curious about there. But just to finish off what I was talking about there, and to link back to the time theme, to sort of answer a question that a few people have raised today, and the sense of the future and predictive policing is very much, to me, a future present. That is, it's not a future out there, it is like the Future and Minority Report that is just seconds ahead. The vision of predictive policing is to be continually extinguishing criminal events as they occur. And in that sense, there's no end to crime because it's perpetually reappearing in the statistics. So it goes on and on and on. There's no sort of end to it. It's a natural fact, just as some of the algorithms, like the earthquake algorithm that's used by Predpol, sees earthquakes as a natural phenomena, crime as a natural phenomena. It just goes on and on and on and on. There's no sense that crime's ever going to be stopped or eradicated. That idea is not there. And I think that's important. And Helga Novotny, a sociologist of time, has suggested that our own era is becoming more and more an extended present without history, if you like. And in some senses, that's what I think is indicated there. There's also an idea that it is everywhere policing, it is total policing, and this is an old idea. The beat system, the whole thought pattern behind that was of a total policing, and it drew its model from a total institution. Vollmer's radio patrol cars, again, are supposed to provide a kind of total policing that appears from anywhere. Predictive policing is another form of that. Just very quickly, one of the things that I think is important, though, is what does it mean about policing, and is policing a skill? Because if the officer's continually being fed with data and being fed with possible decisions based on that data, where are the officer's decisions, and could it reach a point where the officer really is an automaton and is really only reacting to information flows, and that's all they sort of do, that everything becomes data-driven rather than what was thought of as police skill, if you like. And there is also, going back to the earlier part, a kind of perpetually mobilised archive now. The fingerprint archive has now become something that you can bring up on your BlackBerry, and it's right there. So the total archive is there. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. 2 questions quickly, Mark. Yeah. Our box, the flying box, or what it's called. Catch box.
Thanks, Dean. Just, I know you know about this, but it so beautifully connects with your stuff at the end. When you reference Tezar, that's become Axon, you know that they gave all of the police force, or at least they offered all of the police in the US free body cameras. And it seemed like they did it because they wanted to be at the forefront of real-time image analytics. So what you're describing is actually, you know, precisely what's happening, the kind of droning of the police where they become the carrier for the automated vision system that then can provide the data that can be processed in real time. And plus they name themselves Axon. It just...
It's also, that's where the idea, I suppose, the de-skilling or proxy automation of these lights are coming about. Because they have the automatic judgment on them sometimes, in theory, with that. Interestingly, Axon actually removed that particular report and that quotient and replaced it with another one that emphasised the speed and rapidity of administration.
Yeah.
Rather than the rather spooky scenario that we're outlining in that particular one. But it's a fascinating report, actually. It's still around.
Thank you. Another question? Catchbox. I have a few questions, Dean, but I'll bother you later on. Thank you very much for this excellent kind of excursion into the antecedents of contemporary predictive policing and kind of showing us how this is a management tool, actually, how this bad police is a management tool, and showing kind of contemporary directions in the direction of crowdsourcing policing, right? So you were talking about crowds can become police. So we can cut budgets of police and put people, you know, so people can police themselves. So this kind of crowdsourcing policing.
I will just mention the length of
Yeah.
economy style I mentioned there, but I mean, it's not an accident that predictive policing, the term, comes about in 2008.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much.